There's an old parable you might know about heaven and hell. It begins in hell, where at a long banquet table a feast is laid, a feast beyond all dreaming. The most delicious foods you can imagine are there. Around all the table are the citizens, the denizens of this terrible place who have long spoons attached to their hands. Spoons so long that no matter how hard they try, they cannot reach their own mouths to feed themselves of this delicious feast before them. In the parable, we then turn to heaven, where the same banquet table is laid and all the delicious foods are there, and yet the people all around the table similarly are holding these long, long spoons, but they're in heaven, they're feasting together as they feed one another from these long-handled spoons. We're this worldly religion, but I think these images of heaven and hell, they do and have probably always spoken more to this life, these states of being, states of consciousness and relating that we all find ourselves in, right? You know what it feels like to be that person who's trying to feed yourself without a spoon that you can use. And you know what it's like to be fed, to serve others. Okay, I usually try and avoid this kind of blatant promotion of television, but I have to tell you about one of my models for ministry. Most of you, I'm sure, are familiar with him at this point, Ted Lasso. The indomitable, optimistic buffoon who leaves his American football coaching job. For the uninitiated, he's a football coach, and he goes to the UK where he's going to coach soccer, football. And he doesn't like tea, and he doesn't know anything about soccer, but he manages to make magic happen amongst the team he's coaching through a determined stance of sticking to his principles. But all that's besides the point. The point is that Coach Beard, his strong and silent, gruff philosopher sidekick, is kicking back in a chair one practice, reading The Hidden Life of Trees. And when a colleague complains about not getting enough credit for his ideas, Coach Beard offers the slightly oblique response, you know, we used to believe that trees competed with each other for light, but Suzanne Simard's fieldwork challenged that perception, and we now realize the forest is a socialist community. Trees work in harmony to share the sunlight. Some of you will remember last year we started the year of worship thinking about a metaphor of our theological house. And we were talking about each different part of the house represented a different aspect of systematic theology, and the foundation was that theological anthropology, or what is human nature and how does it relate to the ground of being, or however we might name God. And we are inheritors of a lot of different visions, ideas of that theological anthropology, different ideas about what is human nature. Many of us are steeped in the idea of a survival of the fittest notion of the root nature of things. Competition that leads to consumerism. We become, in the language of our newspapers, consumers rather than human beings first in this view of human nature. It focuses on resource scarcity. It understands relationships to be driven by the needs of individuals, of individual organisms, individual tribes, of individual species to outcompete for the ability to survive and reproduce. And our own Unitarian ancestor, Charles Darwin, might be inadvertently, I think, responsible for some of this idea of this survival of the fittest worldview. But there's a different understanding that we're coming to ground ourselves in, a different theological anthropology that says, no, the nature of things, the nature of life in its roots is a cooperative endeavor. And Suzanne Simard, she is a tree scientist in British Columbia and has spent her professional life understanding just how the root systems of trees cooperate with one another, the way the mycorrhizal fungi help to facilitate the transfer of nutrients between not only trees of the same species, but even sometimes trees of different species, exchanging particular minerals for carbohydrates under the soil in order to maximize everyone's potential for growth. When seen from a wide enough lens, the basic orientation of an ecosystem is not competition but cooperation. The variation in kinds of trees of an old-growth forest, not to mention the myriad plants of the understory, fungi and creatures, they serve to maximize the shared goal of turning as much sunlight as possible into usable energy. Nothing's wasted. Everything used in tandem to most efficiently benefit all. And I know that anytime we try and describe reality with one of these frameworks, the framework is too thin for actual reality. It's always more complicated. But it is a more accurate way of talking about things than that thinner version of survival of the fittest. That competition, the death, the dog-eat-dog war, it's part of it, but it's a part of this deeper understanding of a symbiotic mutuality. I was thinking about this when our board retreat yesterday met, and one of our board members mentioned when we started sharing the offering plate, there was skepticism. Would it really work to split the collection that we generously give every Sunday with neighboring organizations? Would there be enough? This source of funding to keep the church afloat, would it be okay to give half of it away? These many years later, it's become a point of pride, a part of what makes us who we are and the resiliency that we have through our interconnection, through our mingling of roots with other organizations in our community. It turns out that far from the view of a scarcity mentality, there is more than enough to share, and that we are enriched by the sharing. And I really think this is what it means to be a congregation, to grow our roots in such a way that we foster that kind of mutual dependency. Pastoral care is not some magical thing I've got as the minister, like the great spirit that needs to be met before dawn. Pastoral care is everywhere, coming from everything in the entire world, entire universe, connecting with each other. It's not, and I think this is what, because we're so steeped in these other ideas of human nature, this survival of the fittest that turns into consumers, we can start to think pastoral care might be a service that the church provides. that we have a pastoral associates or minister who are there to offer this service to our members who are the consumers, right? We're just so steeped in this way of thinking, but instead it's actually the spiritual practice every single one of us is called to, an essential function of what it means to be a healthy church ecosystem. I remember a colleague of mine, when I served in Vancouver, he told this story. He was a Mormon, and he had been a Mormon for a long time in his life. He'd been a professor of religion, until one day in the service when his daughter saw the altar boys coming up to do some function in the service and said, "When will I get to do that?" And knowing that she never would, he looked at his wife, and that day they decided to start looking for another faith tradition. He became a Unitarian Universalist minister. But he carried with him this knowing, this deep knowing from his experience in the Mormon church of what it meant to really intermingle roots and take care of each other, to show up in each other's lives day in and day out, and help to provide for the practical needs of daily life. And so when he began serving at this big church in Vancouver, they were very anxious because they didn't have a pastoral care committee, and they were asking him, what was he going to do to get the pastoral care committee going again? And the story that was told to me is that he got up and preached a sermon and said, "You are all the pastoral care committee. You're all the pastoral care committee." And eventually that church, they organized themselves into neighborhood groups, and there were a couple of kind of captains of each neighborhood who made sure that people were connected, who got people together for potlucks every so often, who helped people coordinate for rides when they needed them to doctor's appointments. And the congregation thrived. And I think this ecosystem of care, it goes beyond our human, our people-to-people interactions, even the space that we have, right? I think that's been part of this project that we've had the atrium task force this summer, working on making our atrium the kind of space that will provide an ecosystem to nurture the quality of care and community that we're trying to create here. Space for people to mingle and have small talk conversations. The kind of small talk that Wendell Berry says he was never any good at and then realized was a foundation of community. The small talk that functions like those mycorrhizal fungi, keeping us informed and trusting one another so that when real needs arise, we can show up for them. Space so that we can see out along the view and connect to the natural world that feeds and sustains our spirits. The whole thing made me think of another church I served where I was walking around the halls and a longtime member of the church, we were commiserating together about the state of general disrepair and clutter, stuff. Churches are just magnets for stuff. We were commiserating, and we were talking about how the church had never had a capital campaign to update and take care of its building. It was in need of some real care. And then he looked at me and he wryly smiled and said, it's almost as if, looking around at all the gray hairs in the building, it's almost as if we timed it so the whole thing would fall apart just about when we all die. Our space, the revitalization happened. That conversation and others got people thinking about how they wanted to care for their space, how they wanted their space to reflect the quality of care that was essential to the mission of the congregation. That we are fed by and nourished by the space we inhabit. This mutuality of care, it is the essential function of a congregation. healing, Wendell Berry says, is impossible in loneliness. It's the opposite of loneliness. Conviviality is healing. To be healed, we must come with all the other creatures to the feast of creation. In two of the most harrowing experiences of my life, I lost touch with the roots around me. I lost touch with consensus reality. I experienced psychosis. And both times, what showed up for me day in and day out was my church community. And they didn't figure out what meds I needed to take or what psychiatrist I needed to see. They didn't know just the right treatment plan. But both times, church community showed up with a shoulder for me to cry on in a service, with an auntie who was willing to take me in and have me stay in her spare room, with people who would take a walk. They didn't tell me how to understand it, what meaning to make, but they listened while I made meaning for myself. That consumerist vision of human nature, it says, find the next weekend workshop. That'll save your life. Or find the next 30-day cleanse, or maybe it's psychedelic-assisted therapy, or whatever the next fix is that's going to save your life. But the truth is that no matter how profound and transformational these experiences might be, life goes on. And no experience removes us from the need for an ongoing mutual dependency with others. There's no experience you can have that saves us from the day in and day out reciprocity of community. So let us be saved by potlucks and carpools. Let us be saved by check-in at the beginning of a meeting, or that call just to see how the doctor's appointment went. Be saved by a lingering moment of silence over lunch, by warm eye contact, willing to risk the awkwardness of intimacy. Be saved by remembering someone's name or the pronoun they prefer to be called. Be saved by a handwritten note, by a supercard showing up in the mail, by a candle lit for a loved one. Be saved by a text reminding a friend they're on your mind. Be saved by taking care of each other's kids or accompanying someone on a run for groceries. Be saved by holding someone's hand or touching a shoulder as we end our service, knowing sometimes that brief touch is this week's precious moment to receive that reassurance we all need, that body-to-body contact, letting us know our roots are mingled together. May it be so, and amen.